can imagine a situation where Lavrov and Zelensky and Trump turn up in Istanbul and Putin doesn't. So I think there is, although Thursday is only 48 hours away, I think there is a heck of a lot of water to flow under the bridge before we get there. But I'm still pretty confident in my assessment that Putin will not attend Istanbul.
Hi, I'm Fergus Macphee and welcome to the Trump Report on Times Radio. Joining me today is former British Army Colonel Hamish de Bretton-Gordon. Hamish, thank you so much for joining us on the Trump Report.
Thanks very much for having me.
Now, we've got a lot to get into because it is a huge week for the Trump presidency, arguably one of the biggest weeks so far. The president is currently in Riyadh on his first major overseas trip of his second term. And he also says that he believes that Russia will agree to a 30-day ceasefire deal and that he himself might even go to Istanbul on Thursday if he believes something can be achieved. Where do you stand with it all?
Well, you're right. It is a heck of a week, and to have President Trump this side of the Atlantic, let's hope that Trump is sort of in his clever mood this week rather than his sort of smart-ish mood, so that there is the potential. And I think Trump, whatever we think of him, Trump has the ability to make things happen. So if we concentrate on Ukraine to start with, which I suppose, particularly for us here in the UK, is the most compelling issue that needs to be sorted out. After the rather cynical 3-day ceasefire over the victory in Europe, celebrations both in this country and in Russia, we're now back to normal. But at the back end of that, President Putin said the only way to get a permanent ceasefire is for direct negotiations with the Ukrainians, with President Zelensky, and suggested that they should meet in Istanbul in Turkey this week. Previously, President Zelensky has put a condition that he would only meet or talk directly with the Russians and Putin if there was a 30-day ceasefire guaranteed. But Trump, at the end of last week, told Zelensky, no, you should meet him. Go and meet him in Istanbul. So I think it was on Sunday night, Zelensky said, yeah, I'll drop that condition. President Putin, I will meet you in Istanbul to discuss the ceasefire. Not unsurprisingly, of course, the Russians seem to be a little bit backpedaling at the moment, and a lot of things that they are doing would make you suggest that perhaps a ceasefire and peace is not forefront of Putin's mind. There's reports about Russian build-ups in the north of the country abutting Finland at the moment, which we can come back to because I think it's fairly significant. And some of Putin's usual sort of attack dogs, like Medvedev and Peskov, his spokesman, and also Sergei Lavrov, are sort of reining back a little bit and suggesting that, of course, negotiations will happen on Thursday in Istanbul, but potentially not with President Putin. And to add a little bit of extra spice into the mix, we're just hearing that President Trump has said he might well swing by Istanbul on his way back from Qatar or way back from his Middle East visit. So I think, a lot happening at the moment when we look at the Ukraine perspective. But just sort of wrapping up this a little bit, I think it's very clear that the Ukraine population are really ready for peace after over 3 years of the country being devastated, tens, if not hundreds of thousands of casualties. And now that President Trump seems to be properly involved, that he's got his deal, and we understand he's in the Middle East to do business, not necessarily to create peace and harmony. However, it seems that Putin is not, and I just my own personal reason why he's not. Number one, he hasn't achieved his objectives to subjugate Ukraine, which he said he would, which he's told his people he would, and he's going to find very difficult to square this circle when he's told his people he'll do this, but they're really suffering now. The average Russian can barely afford to buy food and is really struggling. But they look towards the sort of ivory towers of the Kremlin and see Putin and his close aides who are obviously not struggling this way. And quite apart from tens or hundreds of thousands, we understand that the realistic figure for Russian casualties is gusting towards a sort of million. So you almost come to the conclusion that Putin really can't afford peace at the moment because Russian revolutions don't generally end well for the disposed leader, and Putin is more czarish at the moment than Bolshevik. So I think for those reasons, I and certainly what I've written in the Telegraph for later today, saying, I don't think there is anywhere on earth that Putin is going to turn up in Istanbul this week.
And if he doesn't, so that was going to be my next question. You don't think there's much chance, but if he doesn't, of course, Zelensky said he won't be there either.
Well, you're right. Zelensky has said he will only speak to Putin. Now, whether there is some theatre in this, and one doesn't want to sort of go down to that sort of low denominator, but unfortunately, in this war and when Trump is involved, theatre is probably the simplest way to describe things. So it would appear at the moment the likely person to turn up on the Russian side would be Lavrov. And you can imagine a situation where Lavrov and Zelensky and Trump turn up in Istanbul and Putin doesn't. So I think there is, although Thursday is only 48 hours away, I think there is a heck of a lot of water to flow under the bridge before we get there. But I'm still pretty confident in my assessment that Putin will not attend Istanbul. Not least, Putin is absolutely paranoid about his own safety. His own bodyguards have to be searched before they go near him in the Kremlin. And he has at least two doppelgangers trying to lead any potential assassin away from his scent. So, we would all hope that we will get a peace and a ceasefire. But unfortunately, it doesn't look likely on Thursday.
I want to go back to what you said. Obviously, Zelensky originally said he would attend the talks, ceasefire first, and then we know that Trump did that post on Truth Social, and Zelensky said, okay, sure, I'll attend the talks and challenge Vladimir Putin too. Are we starting to see a slightly different relationship between him and Trump, where they're almost working more aligned and saying, okay, we'll put the ball in Vladimir Putin's court and make sure that I am not seen as an obstacle to peace?
I think, yeah, absolutely. There's been a very noticeable shift in their relationship, probably since the mineral deal. And I suppose that's the simplest way to do it. Trump wanted a deal. He appears to have got a pretty good deal, a lot of money in it for the Americans. Presumably, there are going to be American miners in Ukraine pretty soon if they're not there already. So that now that Trump has real skin in the game, and Trump is also realizing. I think he's had a little bit of success with against the Houthis, and he's got a couple of other big issues to go. But he a little bit is like Putin. He wants to be seen as this great emperor, great leader. His legacy. He wants to be seen as the greatest president ever, and I think he said that frequently. So actually creating a peace, however it's formed, is probably now something that Trump really feels that he wants to do. And in that well documented and pictured post during the Pope's funeral, with them sat together, maybe that is where they decide. Well, Trump said, "We will work together now," and hitherto, one have almost been thinking that Trump and his team were in cohorts with Putin and his team. And it seems very clearly the situation has changed. Trump is leaning into the Ukraine. Not only is he releasing US military aid, which had been stalled for a heck of a long time, he is now also encouraging the coalition of the willing, led by Britain and France, to get stuck in as well. So, yeah, it's whether the Zelensky and Trump are in direct communications all the time. I'm sure their teams are, and I'm sure they are talking narratives, and we will see things unfold over the next 48 hours coming out of Trump's team and Zelensky probably in unison rather than against it. But it still, I think, won't change the fact that Putin is very unlikely to appear in Istanbul.
You said in an article over the weekend that Trump is becoming more frustrated with the Kremlin and could start acting decisively against Russia. What would that look like to you?
Well, I think there are a number of things here. When one looks at sort of hard and soft power, what can be done, and as you say, the frustration. One of the main issues that Trump's been talking about hitherto is sanctions, and predominantly about oil. Russia is almost totally reliant on oil to maintain its war economy and pay for its ammunition and tanks, and also to pay off other people to give them ammunition and tanks. Now, that has been buoyed over the last 3 years because the oil price has been relatively high, and people like the Indians and the Chinese and others have been happy to buy their cheap oil. Now, it is no coincidence in my mind that Trump's first visit to the Middle East is to Saudi Arabia, because the Saudis pretty much control the oil price, and they have said they want to drive it below $50 a barrel. OPEC seems to have agreed with them to increase production, and that's obviously what Trump wants as well. At a price below $50 a barrel, Putin is very, very quickly going to run out of money and get into trouble. And even worse than that, at below $50 a barrel, there is no reason for India, China, et al. To buy their oil from the Russians. Much easier to buy it somebody a bit close, and something that doesn't cause angst towards the Americans. And the final bit on this, of course, is that over the weekend, we know that the US and Chinese trade negotiators have been in Geneva. We understand a deal's been cut, which is, seems to be agreed by both leaders of China and the US. It would seem very strange if China did anything to affect that deal, because, of course, its trade with the US vastly overmatches its trade with the Russians. And, of course, the Chinese, if they can buy oil at $50 a barrel from anybody else but the Russians, I'm sure they'll do it.
And you said that it could enact some of these things if he starts to get more frustrated with the Kremlin. And if Putin doesn't turn up on Thursday, as you predict, could that be the moment?
Well, I think it is. I think it could be. It doesn't strike me that Trump is a very patient person, and he is very, he is prone to fire off the hip and make decisions that perhaps with a little bit more thought he might not have made. And this is his show, as it were, and he's directed. So I think Thursday could be a watershed. And it's not only the sort of sanctions, it could be the hard power too. Because if Trump decides to flex his military muscles or suggests that he might do, then Putin and his team, I'm sure, are wise enough to understand that actually an American military commitment to Ukraine is pretty much game over for the Russians. There no way can they sort of match that power. And especially if the European military is behind it, which we understand they are. We understand from various visits last week and the military leaders meeting in Oslo that plans are very well developed for a peace enforcement force to go into Ukraine to maintain any peace. And if it's underwritten by the American military, then it's not quite game over. But Putin is certainly going to be backed into a corner, but again, he is acting czarish at the moment, and that there is revolution in the air, and the modern day Bolsheviks, you can imagine, are chomping at the bit. So I think Trump probably has the potential opportunity to change things markedly in both the hard and soft power approach to this problem. And at the moment, he looks as though he is going to lean on the side of the Ukrainians, which hopefully will enable Putin to come to the peace table, knowing that actually, if he doesn't, he could be back to square one or back to 2014 before he knows it.
He talks about the hard and soft power there. He said over the weekend, after he said that he helped broker the India-Pakistan ceasefire deal, he even mentioned to reporters about trade, and he says no one else ever really uses trade in the way that I use it. He's obviously, he's currently in Riyadh. There's talk that he's even going to be meeting the president of Syria. He's signed that minerals deal with Ukraine. I mean, is this sort of the art of the deal in action? Does he use trade for foreign policy like nobody else does?
Well, certainly in recent history, he seems to have done. He does seem to have broken all the glass walls about diplomacy and negotiation and politics. And I think it is difficult to criticise. Although I think for a lot of us, and particularly old soldiers like myself, doing a deal over resources rather than resources that are have a financial value rather than resources like humans, does seem a really odd way of doing business. But having said that, it's what works in 2025, and I think everybody in the world wants peace. And if the cost of peace in Ukraine is President Trump doing a deal over $300 billion worth of minerals, then sort of so be it. I mean, at the moment there doesn't really seem to be much of an alternative, and President Trump does not seem to be the sort of person, like perhaps some of his predecessors, who's going to put together a great military force, to charge across Ukraine, as perhaps his predecessors did in Iraq and Afghanistan. So, maybe this is the way to do it. The only, I suppose, my fear in the background is that President Putin is not a businessman. He's a spy, and actually, a lot of his actions have been the actions of a spy rather than a military person. And that is a pretty unsavory and difficult world to work in. So yeah, this is I think new to everybody. But again, I suppose if you can stop the killing by doing deals with money and resources, then so be it. Whatever creates peace the quickest with the least amount of casualties, I suppose one has to applaud it.
Is there a different way that he might need to get the ear of Benjamin Netanyahu? One of the things he's doing in the Middle East is supposedly to try and broker another ceasefire deal. We know that the Israeli-American hostage, Eden Alexander, has been released, but so far it doesn't seem like Israel is that keen on a ceasefire.
Well, I think, although I suppose what is happening in Gaza and Israel is probably furthest from a lot of minds and concerns, particularly in Western Europe and this country. Obviously, for the Americans, it's very close. There is such a huge Israeli lobby in the American U.S. Parliament and across the U.S. and and very much in the financial and business world. So I expect Trump knows an awful lot of these people, and is for his own politics back home, is very keen to try and do a deal that stops the killing in Israel. And a lot of the elements to this are the Iranian proxies like Hamas and Hezbollah and the Houthis. And he's done a good job on the Houthis. The Israelis have pretty much disrupted and destroyed Hezbollah, and Hamas at the moment, are holding the casualties that Netanyahu and the Israelis and the Americans so dearly want back. It's not an accident as well, of course, that Trump decided to go to Riyadh first, to the Saudis, who again, have this strange linkage with the Israelis and also with everybody else in the region, and I'm sure have the ability to influence. And the other element to his visit is the Iranians too, who the potential Iranian conflict with the Israelis is something that everybody would hope would be avoided, and no doubt Trump will be focusing on the potential nuclear issues associated with Iran. But yeah, I mean, I think that Trump really has his the sorting out the Gaza problem is is probably going to be his most challenging and most difficult. And it is of most interest, no doubt, to the Americans and the Israelis, perhaps more than us in Europe. Whereas we're, without wanting to be cynical about it, what happens there really does not affect us, but Russians steaming across Europe absolutely does.
Well, let's go back to Russian steaming across Europe. You discussed it a little bit earlier. It's an article I think you shared to your X account this morning, showing satellite images of Russians amassing troops near the Finnish border.
Yes, this is. I think this was first broken in the American press last week, with I think it was the Wall Street Journal, and widely covered in the British press today. Photographs of Russian build-ups in along the Finnish border. Finland has a border with Russia about 800 miles up in the far cold north, as it were. And I think it's a very interesting move. If I sat down as a Russian general in the Kremlin, it's probably something that I would do as well. We know already from the Baltic states and the Poles, they are really concerned about Russia opening a second front, attacking into the Baltic states or potentially into Poland. And what this has done, it's actually fixed in military terms the Baltic states and Poland, who have said they can't contribute military force to the ceasefire force that Starmer and Macron are putting together because they need to hold their line. And then similarly with Finland, new to NATO, which, I mean, that has really, that really got Putin's goat. He claims one of the main reasons to attack into Ukraine was to stop the expansion of NATO. But of course, that's exactly what his attack did, because then the Finns, who have a reserve army of plus of 1 million people that they can put on the ground very, very quickly, and the Swedes are not that much different. And both Sweden and Finland have very capable, very modern militaries. So, to me, from the Russian perspective, quite a smart move. What it looks like is they're preparing bases where they could put forces that would array against Finland and would fix the Finnish forces up there. However, actually, when you sort of look at what they've done there, they're putting lots of accommodation and lots of sheds for tanks and that sort of stuff. Well, where are they going to get all these people from, and where are they going to get their tanks? Most of the Russian tanks are scrap metal in Ukraine. They've lost over 4,000. And even last week, we heard that T-62 tanks, these are tanks designed in the 1940s, made in the 50s, which, quite frankly, are little more than mobile coffins. These are now being used and sent to Ukraine. So where on earth he's going to get armour and armoured vehicles to go to Finland, nobody knows. And also, how does he support? He's got vast lines of communication there. How does he get fuel and ammunition and everything else up there? There isn't a comprehensive rail and road network like there is in other places. And we know when he has to go to places like North Korea to get ammunition and Iran to get drones, things are getting pretty desperate. So I think the idea of opening up another front there is crazy, but I sort of understand the rationale for doing it, because a raid in Europe, if we suddenly think there might be 2 other fronts open, it's a question of how and where do we put their forces. And the idea that Russia could sweep through the north and down into Europe is crazy. I mean, most of that land up there is sort of tundra and swampland, very, very difficult going. The people who know it really well, are the Finns. So, yeah, I know a lot's been made of it, but I think it's part of a sort of deception plan from the Russians to try and get off balance. And it's probably what we would do anyway ourselves if we were in the same position.
Well, it's something that I'm sure we'll watch closely. I'm afraid that's all we've got time for. Hamish de Bretton-Gordon, thank you so much for joining us on the Trump Report.
Thank you very much for having me.